Hi guys, if you're having trouble focusing, finding a career path that's right for you, may I have a book for you. It's called Managing Oneself by Peter Drucker. It's kind of a mini book, small book. It's by Harvard Business Review Classics is the publisher. And my name is Nick Knightsbridge. I'm going to be doing a summary for you guys on the book. So let's get into it. Just a little forewarning. The book was written at the very latest in the 1960s or 70s. So it's just, bear in mind that this is kind of before machines became so prolific in our lives and before the advent of really computing pretty much. So automation, obviously, which is a worry for people in the future for a lot of fields of employment, etc. So this is written way before that. But I think the information in here is still very relevant and useful. It's just you guys might notice that there's not many references to technology. So let's get into it. The beginning, the first part talks about strengths, basically knowing what they are. You can go through life without really knowing what you're good at if you've never questioned it. Feedback is important. What the author recommends is feedback analysis, basically where you make projections for the next 9 to 12 months. And then you kind of sit down, and after that period, you sit down and evaluate how well you did, what you expected, what actually materialized, and you compare the two, and then you obviously make plans to cater for that, to amend the plan somewhat so that you're more successful and more focused. So and the reason you're doing this is essentially to know your strengths and capitalize them, make them better, stronger, and don't waste time on your weaknesses because to raise them, the author argues that to raise those weaknesses to a mediocrity, it takes a lot more energy than taking your strengths and making them kind of excellent, superb in your whichever field or area you want to focus. And of course, I'm speaking as the author does, speaking in a kind of a generalistic term way. So you can apply this to almost anywhere. I mean, it's obviously written more towards career goals and whatnot, but I can see this being useful in relationships because essentially it's about people management, and so that's really accounts for the vast majority of people's lives, human interaction. So another little tidbit for you. So next section, basically. The author says, Drucker says, that it's important to know what type of learner you are, what type of person you are, how you function well, how you don't function well. Some examples they used was General Eisenhower. And before I get into that, I should say that so he says that some people are better learners when it comes to listening. Some are better readers. And he says that there's half a dozen different ways of learning, essentially. So some people learn, some people by reading, some are better at listening, some are better at writing, some are better at talking even, or showing, or doing, or executing. So one interesting example, it was one of previous U.S. President Eisenhower. He was general, obviously, in the war, Second World War, before he became president. But after he became president, after the death of FDR, he realized that, or rather hadn't realized that he was more of a reader and was really, really notoriously bad for press conferences where people would pose questions and he had to answer them on the spot. He was really bad. As general, he'd have essentially questions submitted on paper, so he was well prepped to answer them. But because Eisenhower, the previous presidents were, good listeners, and they could take oral questions. He kind of wanted to continue the tradition, but he found, I guess, maybe a little bit too late, but he discovered that he was really bad at that, or at least everyone in the press corps and the media discovered that he was really bad at taking oral questions. And if you're this type of person, it's very hard. Not many people are both, for example, readers or listeners, or the other type of, learning mindset that some people have. Not many people fall between the lines. They're generally one or the other. Of course, some people are, a little more diverse and multifaceted, and maybe they can, but most people learn a certain way and they kind of don't deviate from that. And to change that, it takes a lot of energy, or to be learning in a different method takes a lot of energy, and you end up bored. So maybe kind of this helps explain why a lot of people are bored during school years, because it's such a regimented kind of cookie cutter way of teaching, just orally, obviously, and then writing or taking copious notes, etc. It doesn't work for everyone. So a lot of people are very smart, or at least scholastically, they're after school they're well-to-do. Rather, when their education is finished, they become very successful. But in school, it was like torture, basically, because it was the wrong learning method for them. He goes into the author kind of breaks that down further and goes into asking whether whether you're alone, a loner, you work better on a team, whether you're better working alone. Are you the decision maker? Are you the advisor? Because most people are not both, and very few people work well in kind of all these environments, essentially. All right, next section is about values. Now, cool example he used was about the German ambassador, interestingly, to the UK in the first decade of the 20th century. Well accomplished, well known for his diplomacy and his education, rather. He famously refused to host a banquet for Edward VII, the King of England, at the German ambassador's residence, because he knew that the king was kind of a ladies' man, and he was quoted as saying that he'd rather leave than be a pimp for Edward VII, which was interesting. So he was very ethical, basically, ethical man, and he a very ethical man, and he used what's called the mirror test, and that's basically when you look yourself in the mirror and you see whether what you're doing is kind of the direction you want to be going. So if you're asked to do a task that's in your eyes rather unethical, or it kind of runs contra to your values, it's best not to do it, because it's only going to kind of come back and bite you at a later point. And that goes to, of course, that applies to the kind of organization you're working for. Do you share values? Are they compatible? You don't have to agree on every point, but the general direction obviously has to be the same, at least. Otherwise, you're going to have a really hard time with an organization. And whether basically the primary mission of the organization agrees with you, because otherwise you're going to be miserable, pretty much. So if you're not in such an organization, it's really best to cut your losses and leave, because there's going to be opportunities out there that you're going to miss out on, and that's kind of a little advice from myself as well as the author. And he uses a kind of a personal anecdote, mentions that in the 1930s he was an investment banker in London, and he was very good at it, a very astute banker, good with numbers, good with math. But he quit because he was starting to get depressed and money really wasn't helping. Making a lot of money, he said that he he wrote that he was a people person and money didn't interest him. So he decided to leave and go his own way. So next section talks about how to find your strengths. And it asks where you belong, and the way to get that, the way to find those is ask three important questions. And the first one is what are my strengths? Next one is how do I perform? And the last is what are my values? When you ask yourself this honestly, you can start to kind of picture what kind of organization or what kind of a career you really want to pursue, and you should be honest with yourself and other people, and when you are in an organization that you do agree with, that the values you do share with. When you're assigned something, this is from the author, when you're assigned a task or an assignment or something, it should be a kind of a two-way street. It shouldn't be really patriarchal with the boss or maybe your superior telling you this and that and no feedback. You should basically, author says that you should inform them of your strengths. You should, the way you like to learn, the way you learn best, what they should expect of you, and what kind of time frame, because that's who you are. Essentially, you're not gonna change because the boss suddenly wants something done a different way. It's going to be detrimental to you and to the boss because you obviously work best the way you've always worked best and to capitalize on your strengths. So successful careers are rarely found by people not being honest about who they are and how they work and what their superiors should expect from them. This is kind of what essentially turns someone from just an ordinary worker into an outstanding performer. Because if you capitalize on your strengths, that's really the only way to excel. All right. So next question asks about contribution. And again, author talks about knowing your strengths and kind of zoning in on those. And plans, important to note that kind of plans or goals, he says, shouldn't be really made longer than 18-month kind of time spans. So if it's far too far in the future, it's going to be vague, and you're not going to stick to the path, so to speak. So and he says to be clear and specific, so that you can go back and see where you didn't go according to plan, when things kind of went awry, why that happened, and how that can be amended. And also, of course, don't make plans that are unattainable, unrealistic, because you're just setting yourself up for failure. And he says it's foolish. It's not. It's overly optimistic plans are foolish because essentially they kind of demotivate you, and you're less likely to make another plan that you can't stick to. So next section is about relationships. Now, obviously, he's talking about work relationships, but I really do think that it can apply to kind of love life even, actually. So, because as I said at the beginning, people are people, and knowing how to deal with them, and work with them, and is really universal. It's not necessarily just a work thing. So author says that very few people are kind of great at working solo, and we are social beings, and most people work better with others. And so because of this, it's important to remember that co-workers are also human. You know, it's they have their own strengths, their own weaknesses. They have ways they learn better, ways they don't, just like yourself. So essentially, everything that applies to you, let's not forget that applies to everyone else too. You know, maybe we kind of think everyone else out there is kind of a drone or good at everything, because you don't see the weak side. Obviously, people rarely talk about their weaknesses to others. So we all think that everyone else is doing great. So it's not the case. Absolutely not. And one tip that Drucker has for dealing with bosses or colleagues is basically if it's obviously a superior, they call the shots. So to a degree, you have to kind of adapt yourself to how they like to work and how they like things to be done. Of course, with respect to your own benefit, your own strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, if he's asking you to do something that's really outside your field, and then obviously makes no sense. But it's important to communicate that with your colleagues and bosses, and so. That's the next big thing. Communication. It's the best way to avoid conflict. And one of the biggest problems with work-life relationships is that people don't talk to each other, and they don't know really, again, the strengths, the weaknesses of colleagues or bosses, and if colleagues don't come to you, then you should absolutely go to them. And he says it's your fault if you don't. That you're kind of setting yourself up for failure if you don't approach your colleagues and ask them about their strengths and weaknesses, about how they like to work. So when you guys work together, it can be more fruitful, because you can capitalize on their interests, on their strengths. And you can, of course, try and detract or buffer and account for the weaknesses. And very important thing to do. Next section of the book talks about the second half of your life. So basically, when you're close to or at peak level, kind of in your career. And boredom has become a bit of a problem, and he talks about how now obviously people are living much longer, and when you're retiring at 65 or so, and you're expected to live many more years after that, hopefully. What are you going to do? And he recommends basically finding a second career or a parallel career to defeat this. And a lot of people he recommends, and a lot of people go into hobbies and volunteering or a side business. And he says that basically, if you haven't done that by kind of let's say 35 or 40, you kind of are less and less likely to do it in the future. Basically, people who volunteer in their 60s or in their retirement did so when they were younger too, typically, or so the stats are. Of course, as I mentioned, as I alluded to at the beginning of this summary, automation is a bit of a worry, especially for people working in manual labor and kind of, if I may say, blue collar kind of careers. I just wanted to add that it's not touched on by the book for obvious reasons because of the date, but I guess that this is also like doubly important to have a kind of develop a side business or a side job or a hobby or something perhaps something that can kind of provide passive income, because we really don't know what the future brings, and not a lot of fields are completely immune from the threat, if I may say, of automation and the worry of that. Ending the book, author goes into talking about how it may seem really obvious that managing yourself, especially for people in white collar professions, or as he calls it, the knowledge workers, it's very important to manage yourself, because of all the various things, because of all the kind of the peculiarities, the traits, the strengths, weaknesses everyone has, we all kind of, especially people as knowledge workers, need to think like CEOs, and kind of use their strengths as assets, and try and minimize, kind of like a corporation, I guess, minimize their weaknesses. So this is not so much, of course, the case with shift or manual workers, because essentially they're just following orders. So very important, of course, especially in the West, as we move towards white collar business and production, much more manual work and kind of manual production is kind of dying out. Obviously, moving to countries that have bigger margins and less overhead, of course. So, author talks about on the end note is about how in the modern society, the free movement of knowledge and workers has made managing oneself vital to succeed, because society is just changing too fast to be sitting there and just hoping for the best and grabbing every opportunity that comes by, because many probably aren't for you if they're not really, again, capitalizing on your strengths, and don't really involve using things that you're not so great at, or your weaknesses. And that's about it. Well-accomplished author, great book. He's actually written 34 other books, total 34 books, and he's Peter Drucker has counseled governments and big corporations and has done a lot of charity work. So well-accomplished man. Okay, guys, that's it. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Bye.